When Officer James Barton pulled over Eleanor Washington on a rainy evening, he saw only what he wanted to see: an elderly black woman who didn't belong in that neighborhood. He didn't see her decades of legal expertise, her commitment to equal justice, or the gavel she wielded in the nation's highest court. As he dragged her from her car and slapped on handcuffs, Officer Barton had no idea he was detaining a Supreme Court justice, or that this single traffic stop would spark a national conversation about who truly receives justice in America. Eleanor Washington smiled as she drove her old blue sedan through the rainy streets. Her book club had gone longer than usual tonight. The discussion about Maya Angelou's poetry had been too good to cut short. Now the streetlights glowed in the darkness, making yellow patches on the wet road. "Those grandkids are going to wear me out this weekend," Eleanor said to herself with a chuckle. At 68 years old, she had more energy than most people half her age, but her 3 grandchildren could still run circles around her. Rain tapped on the roof of her car as she turned onto Maple Street. She'd made this drive hundreds of times. Eleanor was always careful, but especially on rainy nights like this. Her hands gripped the wheel at exactly 10 and 2 o'clock, just like she'd taught her own children to do years ago. In her rearview mirror, sudden flashing lights made her blink in surprise. Red and blue lights bounced off the wet pavement behind her. "Now, what could this be about?" Eleanor muttered, checking her speedometer. She hadn't been speeding. In fact, she'd been going under the limit because of the rain. Still, Eleanor knew what to do. She put on her turn signal and pulled over to the right side of the road. The police car stopped behind her. Eleanor took a deep breath and waited. She watched in her side mirror as an officer stepped out of the patrol car. He was tall with broad shoulders. His face was hidden under the brim of his hat. The name on his uniform read, Barton. He walked slowly toward her car, one hand resting on his gun. Eleanor reached over to open her glove compartment. Her registration and insurance cards were tucked neatly inside a plastic folder. She always kept them there, organized and ready. "Hands where I can see them!" The shout made Eleanor jump. Officer Barton was at her window now, his face tight with anger. "I was just getting my—" Eleanor began. "Hands on the wheel! Now!" Officer Barton yelled even louder. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. She placed her hands back on the steering wheel and sat up straight. "Officer, have I done something wrong?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Officer Barton didn't answer her question. "License and registration," he demanded. "They're in my glove compartment," Eleanor explained calmly. "May I reach for them now?" Slowly, Officer Barton warned, his hand still on his weapon. Eleanor nodded and carefully opened the glove compartment. She took out her plastic folder and handed her documents to the officer. Rain dripped from his hat onto her window. Officer Barton shined his flashlight on her papers, then into her face. The bright light made her squint. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Eleanor blinked in confusion. "May I ask why, officer?" I said. "Step out of the vehicle." His voice grew harder. "Officer Barton," Eleanor said, reading his name tag again. "I'm happy to cooperate, but I'd like to know why I'm being asked to exit my car in the rain." The officer's face darkened. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. In all her years of driving, she'd been pulled over maybe twice. Once for a broken taillight, and once when she accidentally went through a newly installed stop sign. Both times had been straightforward and polite. This felt different. "Very well," Eleanor said. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "I should mention that I have a bad hip. I'll need a moment to—" Before she could finish, Officer Barton yanked her door open. The sudden movement startled Eleanor. "Out! Now!" His words came through clenched teeth. Please, Eleanor said, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. Just give me a moment to... Officer Barton grabbed her arm. His fingers dug into her skin through her cardigan sleeve. Let go of me, Eleanor gasped. The pain in her arm was sharp, but the shock was worse. You're resisting, Officer Barton said, pulling harder. I am not resisting. I'm simply asking for a moment to get out safely, Eleanor said, trying to maintain her dignity. 2 cars drove by slowly, their headlights illuminating the scene. Eleanor felt a wave of shame wash over her. Here she was, a grandmother being treated like a criminal. Why are you doing this? She asked, looking directly at Officer Barton. What have I done wrong? You fit the description, he replied coldly. The description of whom? Eleanor asked. Instead of answering, Officer Barton pulled her arm again. Eleanor winced as pain shot through her shoulder. Slowly, she swung her legs out of the car. The rain immediately began soaking into her skirt. Officer, I'm a law-abiding citizen, Eleanor said, trying once more. I was simply driving home from my book club. Whatever you think I've done, save it. Officer Barton cut her off. I've heard every excuse in the book. As Eleanor finally stood beside her car, the rain falling on her gray hair, she noticed a young couple across the street had stopped walking. The young man had his phone out, pointing it toward them. Eleanor felt a strange mix of humiliation and relief. At least there were witnesses. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle, Officer Barton commanded. Eleanor did as she was told, the cold rain running down her neck. Her book club tote bag sat on the passenger seat inside, getting wet through the open door. Maya Angelou's words from earlier that evening echoed in her mind. You may shoot me with your words. You may cut me with your eyes. You may kill me with your hatefulness. But still, like air, I'll rise. Eleanor took a deep breath and straightened her back. Whatever was happening here, she would face it with dignity. Spread your feet apart, Officer Barton ordered, his voice harsh against the sound of falling rain. Eleanor carefully moved her feet, wincing as her hip protested. The wet pavement reflected the flashing police lights, turning the world around her into a disorienting blur of red and blue. Officer? Eleanor tried again, her voice steady despite the rain soaking through her clothes. I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Could you please tell me why I've been stopped? You were driving erratically, Officer Barton said, though Eleanor knew this wasn't true. And you have a taillight out. Eleanor frowned. Her car had just passed inspection last month. All her lights were working fine. That's not correct, she said firmly. My taillights are in perfect working order, and I was driving carefully because of the rain. Officer Barton's face hardened. Are you calling me a liar, ma'am? I'm simply stating facts, Eleanor replied. She could feel water dripping from her hair down her neck, but she remained still, her hands pressed against her wet car. Turn around, Officer Barton demanded. Eleanor slowly turned to face him, her back now against the car. The officer loomed over her, his face shadowed beneath his hat. Rain dripped from the brim, but he didn't seem to notice or care that they were both getting soaked. More cars were slowing down now. Eleanor counted at least 3 people with phones out, recording what was happening. She felt a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. She'd seen too many news stories about traffic stops. Gone wrong. Do you have any weapons on you? Officer Barton asked, his hand still resting on his own gun. Of course not, Eleanor said. I'm a 68-year-old grandmother coming home from a book club. The most dangerous thing I have is a hardcover copy of Maya Angelou's poetry. Officer Barton didn't smile at her small attempt at humor. Instead, his eyes narrowed. Your attitude isn't helping this situation, he said. "And what situation is that, exactly?" Eleanor asked. "I still don't understand why I've been pulled from my car in the rain." Without warning, Officer Barton grabbed her arm again and spun her around. Eleanor gasped as pain shot through her shoulder. "Hands behind your back," he ordered. "This is unnecessary," Eleanor protested, but she didn't resist. She'd been a lawyer long enough before her current position to know that resisting would only make things worse. The cold metal of handcuffs snapped around her wrists. The shock of it made Eleanor's breath catch in her throat. In all her 68 years, she had never been handcuffed before. "Officer Barton," she said, struggling to keep her voice even, "I demand to know the specific reason I am being detained and handcuffed. This is a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights." "So you're a lawyer now?" Officer Barton scoffed. "As a matter of fact, I am," Eleanor replied. She had started to say more about her current position but stopped herself. She shouldn't need her title to be treated with basic respect. The young couple Eleanor had noticed earlier was getting closer now. The young woman, wearing a rain jacket with a college logo, called out, "Is everything okay here?" "Stay back!" Officer Barton shouted at them. "This is police business." "We're just concerned," the young man said. He was still holding up his phone, clearly recording. "This doesn't look right." "I said, stay back," Officer Barton repeated, his hand moving to his gun again. The young couple stopped, but didn't leave. The woman pulled out her own phone and appeared to be making a call. Eleanor tried to stand as straight as possible despite the discomfort of the handcuffs. "Officer," she said calmly, "there are witnesses recording this incident. I strongly suggest you reconsider your actions." Officer Barton turned back to her, anger flashing in his eyes. "Are you threatening me?" "No," Eleanor said. "I'm reminding you of the law. I have the right to know why I'm being detained." "I told you, you fit the description," Officer Barton said. "What description?" Eleanor pressed. "Description of whom?" "There was a report of a suspicious person in a blue sedan in this area," he said vaguely. Eleanor shook her head, rain droplets falling from her gray hair. "That could describe thousands of people. What specifically about me matches this suspicious person?" Officer Barton didn't answer. Instead, he took her by the arm again and began leading her toward his patrol car. Eleanor's hip sent sharp pains up her side as she tried to keep up with his pace. "Please slow down," she requested. "My hip should have thought about that before you decided to give me attitude," Officer Barton muttered. From across the street, Eleanor heard someone shout, "Hey, be careful with her!" It was an older Asian man standing in the doorway of a small grocery store. Eleanor recognized him as Mr. Chen, the owner. She'd been shopping there for years. "Eleanor?" Mr. Chen called out, looking shocked. "What's happening?" Hearing. Her name seemed to make Officer Barton even more agitated. He opened the back door of his patrol car and gestured for her to get in. "This is a mistake," Eleanor said, looking him directly in the eyes. "And you know it." "Get in the car," Officer Barton ordered. Eleanor carefully lowered herself into the back seat, the handcuffs making it difficult and painful to maneuver. The inside of the police car smelled of plastic and cleaning products. The partition between the front and back seats made her feel like she was in a cage. Officer Barton slammed the door shut. Through the window, Eleanor could see that quite a crowd had gathered now. Mr. Chen was on his phone, gesturing wildly as he spoke. The young couple was still recording. 2 more cars had pulled over, their drivers standing on the sidewalk and watching. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. In her decades of legal work, she had heard countless stories from Black Americans about unfair treatment during traffic stops. Now, Despite her education, her position, and her age, she was experiencing it firsthand. The injustice of it made her angry, but Eleanor knew that showing anger would only make things worse. So she sat up as straight as the handcuffs would allow, ignoring the pain in her wrists and shoulders, and waited. The rain drummed on the roof of the police car, and the flashing lights continued to paint the night in pulses of red and blue. She was wet, she was in pain, and she was being treated unfairly. But Eleanor Washington would not be broken by this. Not now, not ever. Outside the police car, the young couple who had been recording the incident moved closer. The woman wore a bright yellow raincoat with City College printed on the back. Her companion, a tall young man in a gray hoodie, continued to hold his phone steady despite the rain. "I'm Maria," the woman in the yellow raincoat said to Officer Barton, who was writing something in a small notebook. "This is Jamal. We're law students at City College." Officer Barton barely looked up. "I already told you to stay back." "We're just concerned about what's happening," Maria said. Her voice was firm but polite. "That elderly woman doesn't seem to be a threat to anyone." Jamal nodded, still recording. "We saw the whole thing. She was cooperating." "You didn't see anything," Officer Barton snapped. "And if you don't back up, I'll arrest you both for interfering with police business." From inside the car, Eleanor watched the exchange. Her heart warmed at the young people's bravery, but she worried for them, too. She knew all too well how quickly situations like this could escalate. Maria didn't step back. Instead, she pulled out her own phone and dialed a number. "I'm calling 911, she announced. "I want to report an officer who's using excessive force on an elderly woman." Officer Barton's face flushed with anger. "That's it! You're James!" a voice called from across the street. Mr. Chen was hurrying over, his store keys jingling in his hand. "What are you doing?" "That's Eleanor Washington. She shops at my store every week. She's a judge." Eleanor winced. She had hoped to avoid mentioning her position, but at least Mr. Chen didn't know her full title. Not that it should matter. No one deserved to be treated this way. Mr. Chen reached the edge of the street, his phone also raised and recording. "This isn't right," he said loudly. "She's a respected member of this community." By now, at least 7 or 8 people had gathered on the sidewalk. Some were from the cars that had pulled over. Others had come out of nearby shops or homes. All of them were watching, and many had phones out. Inside the police car, Eleanor could hear Maria speaking to the 911 operator. "Yes, I want to report an officer who's using excessive force. His name is Barton. No, I don't know his first name or badge number. He's handcuffed an elderly black woman during a traffic stop. She wasn't resisting at all. In fact, she mentioned she has a bad hip." Officer Barton paced back and forth beside his car, clearly agitated by the growing crowd and the multiple phones recording him. He glared at Maria, but didn't try to stop her call. More cars slowed as they passed, creating a small traffic jam. A woman in a business suit got out of her car and joined the group of witnesses. "What's going on here?" she asked Jamal. "This officer pulled over that grandmother for no reason," Jamal explained, still recording. "Handcuffed her and everything. She wasn't doing anything wrong." The woman in the suit frowned and took out her own phone. "I'm an attorney," she said. Meanwhile, Mr. Chen had moved to the patrol car window. When he saw Eleanor inside, handcuffed and wet, his face fell. "Eleanor, I'm so sorry this is happening," he said through the glass. "I've called your son's bookstore. Michael is on his way." Eleanor nodded her thanks. The thought of her son seeing her like this, handcuffed in the back of a police car, filled her with a complex mix of emotions. Embarrassment, Yes, but also relief that he was coming. Mr. Chen turned back to Officer Barton. "You've made a big mistake," he said, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea who she is?" "Back away from the vehicle," Officer Barton ordered. "She's a federal judge," Mr. Chen continued, ignoring the command. "You can't just—" "I said back away." Officer Barton moved toward Mr. Chen, his hand again on his weapon. The crowd reacted immediately, voices rising in protest. Maria, still lascive, on the phone with 911, quickly reported the officer's threatening posture. "Now he's threatening an Asian American store owner who's trying to speak up for the woman," she said into her phone. "Please send someone else here right away. This officer is out of control." A few minutes earlier, the street had been quiet except for the sound of rain. Now it was filled with voices, the blue and red lights from the police car reflecting off the wet pavement and illuminating the concerned faces of the growing crowd. Eleanor watched it all through the window of the police car. She was grateful for these witnesses, these everyday people standing up for what was right. But she was also deeply troubled. What if there had been no witnesses? What if Maria and Jamal hadn't stopped? What if Mr. Chen hadn't recognized her? What happened to people who didn't have a crowd of supporters? Who didn't own businesses in the neighborhood? Who weren't known to the community? The injustice of it all settled heavily on Eleanor's shoulders, even as she felt hope seeing these strangers come together to help her. Through the rain-streaked window, Eleanor could see headlights approaching fast. A familiar blue car pulled up across the street. Her son, Michael, was here. But before Michael could cross the street, Officer Barton returned to his police car and got in the driver's seat. He slammed the door and adjusted his rearview mirror, glaring at Eleanor through it. "Your friends out there are making this a lot worse than it needs to be," he said. Eleanor met his eyes in the mirror. "They're not my friends. They're citizens concerned about justice." Officer Barton snorted. "Justice? You were driving with a broken taillight and refused to comply with a lawful order." "Neither of those things is true," Eleanor said calmly. "My taillights are working perfectly. I had my car inspected last month, and I did comply, though you didn't give me time to move safely with my hip condition." "Look, lady," Officer Barton said, turning in his seat to face her. "I don't know who you think you are." "I am a citizen with rights," Eleanor interrupted, "and I have not been informed of why I'm being detained." Officer Barton's radio crackled. "Unit 45, what's your status?" He grabbed the radio. "I've got a situation here. Traffic stop turned into a crowd problem." "Do you need backup?" the voice on the radio asked. "Might not be a bad idea," Officer Barton replied, eyeing the growing number of people outside. Eleanor saw Michael trying to push through the crowd toward the police car. Mr. Chen was speaking to him rapidly, pointing at Eleanor in the back seat. Maria and Jamal were still recording everything, and Maria appeared to still be on the phone with 911. Officer Barton put down his radio and pulled out his laptop. He began typing, occasionally glancing at Eleanor's license and registration. "So," he said after a minute, "you live on Oak Hill Road. Nice neighborhood." "Yes," Eleanor replied simply. "Not many people who look like you up there," Officer Barton said, his tone making the words feel like an accusation. Eleanor took a deep breath. She'd faced this kind of prejudice before, but it never stopped hurting. "I've lived there for 20 years, she said. "My neighbors know me well." Officer Barton muttered, continuing to type. Outside, Eleanor could see Michael arguing with a man who appeared to be trying to hold him back from approaching the police car. Her son's face was a mix of worry and anger. "That's my son," Eleanor said. "May I speak with him?" "Not right now," Officer Barton replied without looking up. "Eleanor, shifted uncomfortably, the handcuffs digging into her wrists. The rain had soaked through her clothes, and she was starting to shiver in the air-conditioned police car. "Officer Barton," she tried again, "I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding. If you check your system thoroughly, you'll find that I know, some kind of judge," Officer Barton interrupted. "Your friend out there mentioned it. But you know what? Judges have to follow the law too." "Of course we do," Eleanor agreed. "I've dedicated my life to upholding the law. That's why I'm concerned about what's happening here." Officer Barton finally looked up from his computer. "You really think you're something special, don't you?" Before Eleanor could respond, another police car pulled up behind them, its lights also flashing. A female officer stepped out and surveyed the scene, the crowd of concerned citizens. Michael, still trying to get to his mother, and Officer Barton in the car with Eleanor handcuffed in the back. The new officer approached Officer Barton's window. He rolled it down just enough to speak with her. "Rivera," he acknowledged. "Got a situation here." "I can see that," Officer Rivera replied, her eyes moving to Eleanor in the back seat. "What's the charge?" "Broken taillight, erratic driving, resisting, compliance," Officer Barton listed off. Eleanor shook her head but stayed silent, watching Officer Rivera's face. The female officer looked skeptical. "Pretty big crowd for a traffic stop," Officer Rivera observed. "Yeah, they all came out of nowhere. Started recording, making accusations," Officer Barton complained. Officer Rivera nodded slowly. "Let me talk to some of the witnesses, get their side." Barton frowned. "Their side? I'm telling you what happened." "Procedure, James," Officer Rivera said firmly. "We've got multiple witnesses. I need to hear from them." As Officer Rivera walked away, Eleanor could see her approaching Maria and Jamal first. The law students immediately started showing her something on their phones, likely the video they'd recorded. Officer Barton watched, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "Great," he muttered. "Now I've got Lisa playing social justice warrior." Eleanor said nothing, but felt a glimmer of hope. Officer Rivera seemed more reasonable, more willing to listen. Through the window, Eleanor watched as Officer Rivera spoke with several witnesses, including Mr. Chen. She then walked over to Michael, who was gesturing frantically toward the police car. Officer Rivera placed a calming hand on his arm as they talked. "Your son seems upset," Officer Barton commented, watching the exchange. "Wouldn't yours be?" Eleanor asked. "If he saw his mother handcuffed in the back of a police car for no valid reason." Officer Barton turned to look at her again. "There was a reason, ma'am. Multiple reasons. None of them true," Eleanor replied steadily. Officer Rivera was now examining Eleanor's car, walking around it slowly. She bent down to look at the taillights, then stood up and appeared to take a photo with her phone. After a few more minutes, Officer Rivera returned to Officer Barton's window. Her expression was serious. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "I'm in the middle of processing this," Barton replied. "Now, James," Officer Rivera insisted, her voice firm. "Privately." "Officer." Barton sighed heavily but opened his door. "Fine." As the two officers stepped away from the car to talk, Eleanor watched them through the rain-streaked window. Officer Rivera was showing something on her phone to Officer Barton. His posture grew defensive, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Eleanor couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could tell from their body language that Officer Rivera was challenging Officer Barton's account of what happened. And from the way Officer Barton's shoulders were tensing, he wasn't taking it well. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, the events of the evening washing over her. What had started as a simple drive home from book club had turned into this. Sitting, handcuffed in the back of a police car, while a crowd gathered outside and officers argued about her fate. But as she opened her eyes, Eleanor knew one thing for certain. When this was over, and it would be over soon, she would use this experience. She would use it to make change. A ringing sound came from Eleanor's purse, which still sat on the passenger seat of her car. Her phone was calling for attention, probably her daughter Tanya, checking to see if she had arrived home safely. Eleanor always called Tanya after book club to let her know she was home. Outside, in the glow of the police lights, Officer Rivera and Officer Barton continued their heated discussion. Eleanor couldn't hear their words, but she could see Officer Rivera pointing at something on her phone, then gesturing toward Eleanor's car. Officer Barton kept shaking his head, his hands planted firmly on his hips. Eleanor's phone rang again, more insistently this time. She could imagine Tanya's growing worry when her mother didn't answer. Tanya was a lawyer, like her mother had been before Eleanor's appointment to the bench. Tanya understood all too well the dangers that could face a black woman alone at night, even one of Eleanor's age and status. In her car across the street, Michael was now on his phone, his face tight with concern. Eleanor guessed he was calling Tanya too, telling her what was happening. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, but the street still shimmered with water. The small crowd remained, huddled under umbrellas and raincoats, watching to see what would happen next. Maria, the law student in the yellow raincoat, approached Officer Barton again. Eleanor couldn't hear what she was saying, but she was speaking with the confidence of someone who knew her rights. "Back off!" Officer Barton's voice was loud enough to carry through the closed windows of the police car. "This is the last time. I'm warning you." Maria didn't move. "I just want to make sure the woman you've detained is okay," she said, her voice steady. "She's been in that car for almost half an hour now, and she mentioned a medical condition." "She's fine," Officer Barton snapped. "How do you know?" Maria challenged. "Have you checked on her? Offered her medical attention?" "Maria," Officer Rivera said, stepping between them. "I appreciate your concern. I'll make sure she's checked on, okay? But I need you to step back for now." Maria hesitated, then nodded and rejoined Jamal on the sidewalk. They kept their phones up, still recording. Mr. Chen was on his phone again, speaking rapidly in what sounded like Mandarin. He kept looking toward Eleanor, his face creased with worry. Across the street, Eleanor saw Michael end his call and rush toward his car. A moment later, he pulled away quickly, tires splashing through a puddle. Eleanor wondered where he was going. Had something happened? Was Tanya okay? Her thoughts were interrupted when Officer Rivera approached the police car and opened the back door. "Ms. Washington," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm Officer Rivera. How are you doing?" "I've been better," Eleanor replied honestly. "These handcuffs are quite uncomfortable, especially with my arthritis." Officer Rivera nodded. "I understand. I'm working to sort this out as quickly as possible." "I appreciate that," Eleanor said. "My phone has been ringing. My daughter is probably worried about me." "Your son mentioned that," Officer Rivera said. "He's gone to pick her up now." Eleanor nodded, relief washing over her. Soon both her children would be here. That was both comforting and troubling. She hated for them to see her like this, but she needed their support. "Officer Rivera," Eleanor said quietly, "I think you know this is a mistake." Rivera glanced toward Officer Barton, who was now back in his car, angrily filling out paperwork. "I'm reviewing the situation," she said carefully. "The taillights on your vehicle are functioning properly, and several witnesses have provided video showing you weren't driving erratically." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you for checking." "Just doing my job," Officer Rivera replied. She hesitated, then added, "Your son mentioned you work in the legal system?" Eleanor met her eyes. "Yes, I do." Before she could say more, a new car pulled up. Eleanor recognized it instantly, Tanya's sleek silver sedan. Her daughter had arrived even faster than Eleanor expected. Michael must have called her when she was already on her way. Eleanor watched as Tanya jumped out of her car, not bothering with an umbrella despite the drizzle. Michael emerged from the passenger side, and the two of them rushed toward the police car. Officer Barton immediately got out, moving to intercept them. "Ma'am, sir, stay back," he ordered, one hand raised. "That's my mother." Tanya's voice carried, clearly through the night air. "I demand to know why she's being detained." Eleanor watched her daughter, so fierce and determined. Tanya had Eleanor's same sense of justice, the same unwillingness to back down when faced with wrong. As Tanya confronted Officer Barton, Eleanor felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in her daughter's courage, worry for her safety, and hope that soon this ordeal would end. "I'm Tanya Washington," her daughter announced, her voice clear and strong despite the rain. "I'm an attorney, and I demand to know on what grounds my mother is being detained." Officer Barton crossed his arms. "Your mother was driving with a broken taillight and failed to comply with lawful orders during a traffic stop." "That's simply not true," Tanya replied, "and I want to see her right now." "This is an ongoing police matter," Officer Barton said. "You need to step back." Michael stepped forward, placing a calming hand on his sister's shoulder. "Officer," he said, his voice steadier than Eleanor had expected, "we just want to make sure our mother is okay. She has health conditions that require attention." "She's fine," Officer Barton insisted. "How would you know?" Tanya challenged. "Have you asked her? Have you offered her medical assistance? She's 68 years old, and you've had her handcuffed in a police car for almost 40 minutes now." From inside the car, Eleanor could see the crowd growing larger. Word must have spread through the neighborhood. She recognized several faces from local shops and community events. The rain had nearly stopped, but people still huddled under umbrellas, watching the confrontation with concern. Officer Rivera approached Tanya and Michael. "Ms. Washington, Mr. Washington," she said, her tone professional but much gentler than Officer Barton's. "I understand your concerns. I've spoken with your mother, and I'm working to resolve this situation." "Then remove the handcuffs," Tanya insisted. "There's no legal justification for restraining her." Officer Barton stepped between them. "That's not your call to make." "Actually," Tanya said, pulling a business card from her pocket, "as her legal representative, it is my call. And if those handcuffs aren't removed in the next 5 minutes, I'll be filing a formal complaint against you personally, Officer Barton." Officer Barton's face darkened. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm informing you of the legal consequences of your actions," Tanya replied calmly. Eleanor watched the exchange with growing concern. The situation was escalating, and she worried that Officer Barton's anger might now focus on her children. She tapped on the window with her handcuffed hands, trying to get Officer Rivera's attention. Officer Rivera noticed and moved away from the confrontation between Tanya and Officer Barton. She opened the back door of the police car again. "Yes, Ms. Washington?" she asked. "Please," Eleanor said, her voice low. "I'm concerned about my children." Officer Barton seems very agitated. Officer Rivera nodded. "I understand. This has gotten out of hand." She glanced back at Officer Barton, who was now telling Michael to back up, his hand again resting on his weapon. "Let me talk to my colleague privately." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Officer Rivera closed the door and walked quickly to Officer Barton. She touched his arm and spoke to him quietly but urgently. He shook his head repeatedly, but finally followed her a few steps away from Tanya and Michael. Through the window, Eleanor could see the two officers engaged in an intense conversation. Officer Rivera was showing Barton something on her phone again, likely the videos the witnesses had taken. She then pointed at Eleanor's car, particularly toward the taillights that Officer Barton had claimed were broken. Officer Barton's posture grew increasingly defensive. He gestured wildly with his hands, his face flushed even in the blue and red glow of the police lights. Officer Rivera remained calm, speaking in measured tones and occasionally placing a hand on his arm to lower it when he grew too animated. Meanwhile, Tanya had approached the police car when she saw Eleanor through the window, handcuffed and still damp from the rain. Her composed lawyer's facade cracked for just a moment. Eleanor could see the pain and anger in her daughter's eyes. "Mom," Tanya said, her voice catching slightly, "we're going to get you out of there, I promise." Eleanor nodded. "I know, sweetheart. I'm okay." "This is outrageous," Tanya continued, her professional composure returning. "Absolutely outrageous. We're going to make sure this never happens to anyone else." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "We will." Michael joined his sister at the window. "Mom, do you need anything? Water? Your medication?" "My purse is still in my car," Eleanor said. "My blood pressure pills are in there. I should have taken them an hour ago." Michael nodded and immediately turned toward Eleanor's car. But Officer Barton's voice stopped him. "Don't touch that vehicle," he shouted. "It's part of an investigation." "My mother needs her medication," Michael replied, his voice rising. "Then we'll get it for her," Officer Rivera interjected, stepping between them. "Michael, right? Why don't you show me where her purse is, and I'll retrieve her medication." Michael hesitated, then nodded. He and Officer Rivera walked to Eleanor's car, where he pointed out her purse on the passenger seat. Officer Barton watched them with narrowed eyes, then turned back to Tanya. "You people always make things more difficult than they need to be." "You people?" Tanya repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. "Lawyers," Officer Barton said, though his tone suggested he meant something else entirely. "I think we both know that's not what you meant," Tanya replied coldly. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. The situation was growing worse by the minute. What had started as a simple traffic stop, one that shouldn't have happened in the first place, was now a tense standoff with potentially serious consequences. When she opened her eyes again, she saw Officer Rivera returning with her purse. The officer opened the door and handed the bag to Eleanor. "Your son said your medication is in the side pocket," Officer Rivera said quietly. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, awkwardly maneuvering with her handcuffed hands to retrieve her pills. "Here," Officer Rivera said, reaching into the car. "Let me help you." Eleanor was surprised when, instead of just helping with the medication, Officer Rivera produced a small key. "I'm going to remove these handcuffs, Ms. Washington. They seem unnecessary in this situation." As the handcuffs fell away, Eleanor rubbed her wrists gratefully. "Thank you, Officer Rivera." Officer Rivera lowered her voice. "I checked your ID in our system. I know who you are, Your Honor. I'm sorry about all of this." Eleanor nodded but said nothing. Her position shouldn't matter. No one should be treated the way she had been tonight. "I need to speak with Officer Barton again," Officer Rivera continued. "Things are going to change very quickly now, I promise." As Officer Rivera walked back to her increasingly agitated colleague, Eleanor took her blood pressure medication and watched through the window. The truth was about to come out, and she wondered how Officer Barton would react when he realized exactly who he had handcuffed and confined in his police car on this rainy night. Michael stood protectively near the police car, occasionally glancing at his mother through the window. Tanya was on her phone, speaking rapidly and making notes. Eleanor knew her daughter well enough to recognize that she was building a case, documenting everything that had happened tonight. "Mom," Michael said through the partially open window, "are you feeling any better now that you've had your medication?" Eleanor nodded. "Much better, thank you." She lifted her freed wrists. "And it helps to have those handcuffs off." Michael's eyes darkened with anger. This never should have happened. None of it. "I know," Eleanor agreed softly, "but it did happen. And now we need to make sure it leads to something good." In the distance, Eleanor heard the wail of another siren approaching. More backup was arriving. The crowd of witnesses had grown to at least 20 people, many of them recording with their phones. Word had clearly spread through the neighborhood about what was happening. Eleanor could see Officer Rivera and Officer Barton still in intense conversation. Officer Rivera was holding up her phone, showing Officer Barton something on the screen. His face shifted from angry to confused, then to something that looked like disbelief. "No way," she heard him say, his voice loud enough to carry. "That's not possible." Officer Rivera nodded grimly and showed him something else on her phone. Officer Barton's face drained of color. A third police car pulled up, its lights flashing, but siren now silent. A tall officer with captain's bars on his uniform stepped out and surveyed the scene with concern. Officer Rivera immediately approached him, speaking quickly and gesturing toward Eleanor in the police car. Tanya finished her call and joined Michael at the window. "Mom, I've spoken with Judge Rodriguez. He's furious about what's happened. He wanted me to tell you that he's contacting the police commissioner directly." Eleanor sighed. This was exactly what she hadn't wanted. Special treatment because of who she was. "That's not necessary, Tanya." "With all due respect, Mom, it is necessary," Tanya insisted. "Not just for you, but for everyone this could happen to. This has to stop." Michael nodded in agreement. The system only changes when people with power push for it to change. Eleanor knew they were right, but it still troubled her. A grandmother without her connections would still be sitting here in handcuffs. The captain was now speaking with Officer Barton, whose posture had changed completely. Gone was the aggressive stance, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. The captain's expression was stern as he pointed toward the police car where Eleanor sat. "I think things are about to change," Michael observed, watching the officers. He was right. The captain, followed by Officers Rivera and Barton, approached the police car. Officer Barton hung back slightly, his eyes fixed on the ground. The captain opened the car door fully. "Justice Washington," he said formally, "I'm Captain Williams. On behalf of the department, I want to express our deepest apologies for this unfortunate incident." Eleanor stepped carefully out of the police car, smoothing her rain-dampened skirt. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate that. Your daughter informs me that you've been detained for over an hour without cause," Captain Williams continued. "I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated." Eleanor nodded, standing tall despite her fatigue. "I'm less concerned about my own experience than I am about what happens to people who don't have lawyers for children or friends recording videos." The captain had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Yes, ma'am. That's a valid concern." Tanya stepped forward. "We'll be filing a formal complaint, Captain, and we'll be requesting all body camera footage, dispatch records, and reports related to this incident." "Of course," Captain Williams agreed quickly. "We'll cooperate fully." Throughout this exchange, Officer Barton remained silent, his eyes still fixed on the ground. Officer Rivera stood beside him, her expression professional, but her eyes occasionally glancing at her colleague with something like disappointment. The crowd of witnesses had grown silent, watching the scene unfold. Many still had their phones up, recording everything. Eleanor could hear whispers spreading through the group as people realized who she was. That's Justice Washington. The Supreme Court Justice? Oh my God, they arrested a Supreme Court Justice. Michael put a protective arm around his mother's shoulders. Let's get you home, Mom. You're soaking wet, and it's been a long night. Eleanor nodded, suddenly feeling every one of her 68 years. The adrenaline that had kept her going was fading, leaving behind bone-deep weariness and lingering anger. As they turned to leave, Officer Barton finally looked up. His face was a mix of emotions: embarrassment, fear, defensiveness. "Justice Washington," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know." Eleanor fixed him with a steady gaze. "Would it have made a difference, Officer Barton? If I'd been just Eleanor Washington, grandmother, with no title before my name? Would you have treated me any differently?" Officer Barton had no answer, and Eleanor hadn't expected one. The question wasn't really for him anyway. It was for everyone watching, everyone recording, everyone who would hear about what happened tonight. It was a question for America. The silence that followed Eleanor's words was broken only by the soft patter of renewed rainfall. No one moved. Not the officers, not the crowd of witnesses, not even Tanya and Michael, who stood protectively beside their mother. Officer Barton's face flushed red. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. It was Officer Rivera who finally broke the silence. She stepped forward, her posture respectful but not subservient. "Justice Washington," she said, "your question is fair. And the answer should be no. It shouldn't make a difference. We're trained to treat everyone with the same respect and dignity." She glanced at Officer Barton, then back to Eleanor. "Tonight, that didn't happen, and I apologize for that." Eleanor nodded, appreciating the officer's honesty. "Thank you, Officer Rivera." Captain Williams cleared his throat. "Justice Washington, we'd like to take your statement about tonight's events, but perhaps we could do that tomorrow, after you've had a chance to rest." "That would be fine," Eleanor agreed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Her clothes were still damp from the rain, and her shoulders ached from being handcuffed for so long. "I'll drive you home, Mom," Michael said, gently guiding Eleanor toward his car. "What about my car?" Eleanor asked, looking back at her sedan, its door still open from when Officer Barton had pulled her out. "I'll take care of it," Tanya said. "I'll drive it home for you." As they walked toward Michael's car, the crowd of witnesses parted respectfully. Several people called out words of support. "We're with you, Justice Washington. We saw everything. We've got it all on video." Maria and Jamal, the law students who had first stopped to help, approached cautiously. "Justice Washington," Maria said, her voice filled with awe. "I'm so sorry about what happened tonight. We have everything recorded." "Thank you both," Eleanor said sincerely. "Your willingness to stand up and get involved made a difference. Most people would have walked by." "We couldn't do that," Jamal said. "It wasn't right." "No, it wasn't," Eleanor agreed. "And that's exactly why what you did matters so much." As they continued toward Michael's car, Mr. Chen hurried over from his store, carrying a paper bag. "Justice Washington," he said, slightly out of breath. "Please, take this. Ginger tea with honey. Good for shock and cold." Eleanor smiled, deeply touched by the shopkeeper's kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Chen. That's very thoughtful." "I called many people," Mr. Chen said proudly. "Made sure there were witnesses. No one should be treated this way, especially not you." "Especially not anyone," Eleanor corrected gently. but thank you for your help tonight." As Michael helped her into his car, Eleanor looked back at the scene one last time. Officer Barton was now sitting in his patrol car, head in his hands. Officer Rivera was speaking with the witnesses, taking contact information. Captain Williams was on his phone, his expression serious. The crowd was beginning to disperse, though many people lingered, still talking about what they had witnessed. Some were already posting their videos online. By morning, Eleanor knew this incident would be national news. Michael started the car and turned up the heat. "Are you okay, Mom? Really okay?" Eleanor sighed, finally letting some of her carefully maintained composure slip now that they were alone. "I'm angry, Michael. And I'm sad. And I'm very, very tired." "I know," Michael said softly. "When Mr. Chen called the store and told me what was happening, I've never been so scared and so angry at the same time." "I was scared too," Eleanor admitted. "Not just for myself. I kept thinking about all the people this happens to who don't have witnesses recording, who don't have children who are lawyers, who don't have a title that makes police captains apologize." Michael nodded as he carefully pulled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, Eleanor could see Tanya getting into her car, talking on her phone as she did so. Probably calling her husband to let him know what had happened, Eleanor thought. "What are you going to do about this, Mom?" Michael asked, after a few minutes of silence. Eleanor looked out at the rainy night, streetlights blurring through the wet windows. "What I've always done, Michael. Use the law to make things better." "Officer Barton should be fired," Michael said, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Perhaps," Eleanor said, "but firing one officer won't fix the bigger problem." As they drove through the quiet streets toward Eleanor's home, she thought about the case she was currently hearing on the Supreme Court. It involved police procedures and reasonable suspicion. The parallels to her own experience tonight were not lost on her. When they finally pulled into her driveway, Eleanor saw that Tanya had arrived first and turned on the porch lights. The familiar sight of her home, the wide front porch with its swing, the carefully tended garden, the stained glass window beside the door, brought a wave of emotion. Tonight, she had been made to feel like a stranger in her own community, unwelcome and suspicious because of the color of her skin. Michael came around to help her out of the car, but Eleanor waved him off, needing to prove to herself that she could stand on her own. Her hip ached and her wrists were sore from the handcuffs, but she walked up the path to her front door with her head held high. Inside, the warmth and familiar comfort of her home wrapped around her. Eleanor slowly removed her damp cardigan and hung it up, her movements deliberate and careful. "Mom, let me make you some tea," Michael offered, heading toward the kitchen with Mr. Chen's paper bag. "That would be lovely," Eleanor said. "And then, I think I need to make some calls." "Tonight?" Michael asked, concerned. "It's late and you've been through a lot." Eleanor's expression was determined. "Yes, tonight. Some things can't wait until morning." As Michael went to make tea, Eleanor picked up her house phone. Tonight had shown her, in the most personal way possible, that the justice system she had devoted her life to still had deep, troubling flaws, and she was in a unique position to do something about it. The first call she made was to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. By morning, the video had gone viral. Millions of people watched as a black grandmother was pulled from her car, handcuffed, and detained for no legitimate reason. The hashtag #JusticeForJustice was trending nationwide. News helicopters hovered over Eleanor's neighborhood, and reporters crowded her front lawn. Inside, Eleanor sat calmly at her kitchen table, sipping tea and reviewing notes with Tanya. "CNN is on line 1, Michael said, peeking his head into the kitchen. MSNBC on line 2, Fox News on line 3, and the White House has called twice. Eleanor nodded. Tell them all the same thing. I'll be making a statement at noon from the steps of the Supreme Court. The phone rang again. Michael sighed and went to answer it. Mom, are you sure about this? Tanya asked. You don't have to make a public statement at all. This is a personal trauma you've experienced. Eleanor reached across the table and squeezed her daughter's hand. It stopped being just personal the moment Officer Barton pulled me over. This is about something much bigger than me. Michael returned to the kitchen. That was the police commissioner. He says Officer Barton has been suspended pending investigation, and he'd like to meet with you privately before your press conference. Eleanor shook her head. Tell him I appreciate the gesture, but no. This isn't about one officer or one department. It's about a system that needs to change. 3 hours later, Eleanor stood at a podium on the steps of the Supreme Court building. 9 microphones from different news outlets were arranged before her. Cameras flashed. The crowd of reporters and onlookers stretched far down the street. Eleanor wore her judge's robe, a deliberate choice that symbolized both her position and the gravity of the moment. Her children stood behind her, along with Maria and Jamal, the law students who had been the first to stop and help. Good afternoon, Eleanor began, her voice strong and clear despite her exhaustion. Last night, I experienced something that thousands of Black Americans experience every day. I was pulled over without cause, forcibly removed from my vehicle, handcuffed, and detained, all without explanation or justification. The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. What happened to me was wrong, but it is not unique. What makes my story different is not what happened, but who it happened to. Eleanor paused, looking out at the sea of faces. I stand before you today not just as a victim of police misconduct, but as Associate Justice Eleanor Washington of the United States Supreme Court. A murmur ran through the crowd as those who hadn't known her identity now realized the full significance of what had occurred. The officer who detained me did not know who I was. He saw only what he chose to see, an older Black woman driving a car in a neighborhood where he believed she didn't belong. Eleanor's voice remained measured, but her words carried powerful emotion. When he discovered my identity, his behavior changed immediately. The same system that had moments before treated me as a criminal suddenly treated me with deference and respect. This transformation reveals the fundamental injustice at work. The Constitution promises equal protection under the law for all Americans, not just those with titles or power or privilege. Eleanor gripped the sides of the podium. I have spent my life in service to the law. I believe in our system of justice, imperfect though it may be. But I also believe that we must acknowledge its flaws honestly if we hope to mend them. She looked directly into the main camera. To Officer James Barton, I do not hate you. I do not seek your punishment as an end in itself. What I seek is your understanding. What I seek is change, not just in your behavior, but in the systems and prejudices that shaped it. Eleanor took a deep breath before continuing. To those watching who have experienced similar treatment, I see you. I stand with you. Your experiences matter, whether or not you wear a robe, whether or not cameras record what happens to you, whether or not your name makes headlines. The crowd had grown completely silent. Many people were wiping away tears. And to my colleagues, on this court and in every court across our nation, we cannot truly deliver justice if we do not understand injustice. The law is not merely words on paper. It is lived experience. It is the difference between dignity and humiliation, between freedom and confinement, between life and death. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, her voice growing stronger. Today, I am announcing the creation of the Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization that will work to combat bias in policing and ensure that every American receives the same treatment under the law, regardless of who they are or what position they hold. She gestured to Maria and Jamal, who stepped forward to stand beside her. These two young law students were the first to stop and bear witness when they saw something wrong. They remind us that justice depends not just on those who wear robes or uniforms, but on all citizens who refuse to look away from injustice. Eleanor's eyes scanned the crowd once more. I will continue to serve on this court with renewed purpose and perspective. The experience I had, though painful, has deepened my understanding of the constitutional protections that are my duty to uphold. As she prepared to conclude, Eleanor saw Officer Rivera standing at the back of the crowd, out of uniform, but watching intently. Finally, I wish to acknowledge Officer Lisa Rivera, whose integrity and professionalism helped resolve a situation that could have ended much worse. She represents the best of what law enforcement can be: fair, respectful, and committed to justice, rather than power. Officer Rivera nodded slightly, a gesture of mutual respect between two women who had met under difficult circumstances but found common ground in their commitment to doing what was right. The path forward is not easy, Eleanor said, her voice solemn. But as a nation founded on the principle that all are created equal, we have no choice but to walk it together. Thank you. The crowd erupted in applause as Eleanor stepped away from the podium. Reporters shouted questions, but she did not turn back. She had said what needed to be said. As she walked up the steps of the Supreme Court, flanked by her children, Eleanor thought about the case waiting on her desk, the one involving police procedures and reasonable suspicion. She would approach it now with new insight, new understanding. The law was not abstract to her, not anymore. It never would be again. Behind her, the crowd continued to applaud. Before her lay the marble halls where she would continue her life's work, now with an even deeper commitment to ensuring that the promise of equal justice under law was kept for everyone, not just those with titles before their names. Eleanor Washington, grandmother, mother, and Supreme Court Justice, squared her shoulders and walked through the doors, ready to turn a night of injustice into a legacy of change. 3 months later, Eleanor sat at the front of a community center meeting room, watching as police officers from across the city filled the seats before her. Among them was Officer James Barton, sitting in the second row, his posture stiff but attentive. "Thank you all for coming today," Eleanor began, her voice warm but firm. "This is our 6th session together, and I've been impressed by your openness and willingness to engage in difficult conversations." The room was quiet. On the walls hung posters created by local school children expressing what justice meant to them in colorful drawings and simple words. "Fairness for everyone," read one. "Same rules for all people," read another. After her press conference 3 months ago, Eleanor had surprised many by choosing not to file charges against Officer Barton. Instead, she had proposed something different, a training program where officers would learn about bias and community relations directly from legal experts, community members, and Eleanor herself. Today, Eleanor continued, we're going to discuss the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure, not just as words on paper, but as lived experience. She made eye contact with Officer Barton, who nodded slightly. In the weeks following the incident, he had faced disciplinary action from his department, but he had also done something unexpected. He had apologized publicly and sincerely and had asked to be part of the solution. Officer Barton, Eleanor said, "Would you like to share your perspective with the group?" Officer Barton stood, clearing his throat nervously. 3 months ago, I made a series of mistakes that could have had serious consequences. I stopped Justice Washington without proper cause. I escalated the situation when there was no need. I let assumptions guide my actions instead of facts. He looked around the room at his fellow officers. I've had to face some hard truths about myself, about biases I didn't want to admit I had, about how power can change the way we treat people. And I've committed myself to being part of the change we need. Eleanor nodded appreciatively. Officer Barton's journey hadn't been easy, but it had been genuine. He had become an advocate for reform within his own department, speaking candidly about his mistakes and what he had learned from them. After the training session, Eleanor gathered her notes as the officers filed out. Officer Rivera, now a regular participant and co-facilitator in the program, approached her. "Your opinion just came down, didn't it?" Officer Rivera asked. "On the Martinez case?" Eleanor nodded. The Martinez case had been the one on her desk, the night of the incident, the case involving police procedures and reasonable suspicion. Yes, it was released this morning. The court ruled 6-3 that officers must articulate specific, individualized reasons for stops and searches, not just general descriptions or feelings of suspicion. Officer Rivera smiled. "Your concurring opinion was powerful, Justice Washington." "Thank you," Eleanor replied. "I wrote it with our community in mind." What she didn't say was how deeply her experience had informed her judicial reasoning, how sitting handcuffed in the back of a police car had given her insights no law book ever could. As Eleanor left the community center, she decided to drive to the spot where she had been pulled over 3 months ago. The street looked different in daylight, ordinary, peaceful. Yet for Eleanor, it would always be a place of transformation. She pulled over at the exact same spot and sat for a moment, reflecting on all that had happened since that rainy night. Her Equal Justice Initiative had already secured funding to provide body cameras for every police department in the state. The Supreme Court had taken up 2 more cases involving police practices, with Eleanor bringing her uniquely informed perspective to the deliberations. And her story had inspired legislation now moving through Congress to establish clearer guidelines for traffic stops and police interactions. A police car pulled up beside her, and for a moment, Eleanor felt a flash of anxiety. Then she saw who it was: Officer Rivera, checking to see if everything was all right. Eleanor rolled down her window. "Just taking a moment to reflect, Officer Rivera." Rivera nodded understandingly. "A lot has changed since that night." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "But we still have so much more to do." "We're doing it together, though," Rivera pointed out. "Officers, communities, courts, all working for the same goal." Eleanor smiled. "That's how change happens. Not because of one person's title or position, but because enough people decide that the way things are is not the way things should be." As Officer Rivera drove away with a friendly wave, Eleanor sat for a moment longer, thinking about her grandchildren, who would be visiting this weekend. They were growing up in a world that was still imperfect, still unjust in many ways, but they were also growing up seeing their grandmother turn pain into purpose, injustice into action. Eleanor started her car and pulled back onto the road. The evening sun cast long shadows across the pavement as she drove toward home, toward family, toward the future she was helping to build, one where justice truly was for all. Thank you for joining us for A Matter of Justice. We'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location in the comments below. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We're committed to bringing you compelling stories that spark important conversations. Remember, justice and kindness begin with each of us. Share this video to spread awareness and keep the conversation going. Until next time, this is Channel Name, where stories matter.